The doctor is in. No religion allowed here, just grace and truth. You've entered the No Religion Zone with Pastor Greg Lilly.
Hey, you've just entered the NRZ, the No Religion Zone. Get ready to be liberated. I did not get to Jacob last week. I got too much going on and I had to put it off for this week. You don't want to miss today. We're going to talk about Jacob regarding that this whole new covenant is a covenant of promise. But let's start over, give you a couple scriptures before we jump into the story. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12, listen to what Paul says. Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in this world. Now, many covenants are in the Bible, maybe 7 to 9 covenants, I think, but only one was conditional. The other ones, the rest of them, are unilateral, meaning they're one-sided. God is the one making the promises. And all the other side, the other party needs to do is believe and trust. Isn't that what we see with Abraham? God, out of the blue, calls Abraham in the land of the Chaldeans and starts just making promises to him. And it says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now, we're in the new covenant. Now remember, there's only one covenant, the Mosaic covenant. It was conditional. But the Abrahamic covenant was not conditional. Now, when you get to the book of Galatians, Paul is going to tell us, because the book is all about him fighting the Judaizers. See, they said, yeah, Christ, but you got to go to the law too. So Christ plus the law. Now they're trying to bring Moses and Jesus together. They're really trying to bring the Mosaic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant together. And Paul's not going to have it. Paul's not going to have it. Now watch this. Watch this. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 18, he is going to set the record straight. He says, for if the inheritance depends on the law, then it no longer depends on promise. These are contrary. It can't be law and promise. Paul's setting the record straight. No more Moses. That was the only covenant that wasn't unilateral. It was based on conditions. If you do this, I'll do that. Why in the world does the church keep taking its cues from Moses? It's called religion. It's the tree of knowledge and good and evil. So he says, and Paul's setting the record straight, for if the inheritance depends on the law, now watch this, then it no longer depends on promise. But God gave it to Abraham through promise, and it's all by his grace. You see that there in Galatians 3:18. Now, in the new covenant, God relates to man on the basis of promise, and that's why in Ephesians 2, he says it's a covenant of promise. And we dealt with that last week and developed it even more. We don't make promises to God. You don't make commitments to God. You don't make promises. You don't barter with God in any way, shape, or form. This is a unilateral covenant. It all depends what he's promising. It's all depends what he's already called. And we talked about that, the eulogy, last week, before the foundation of the world. He's already made these promises to us. Now, people try to relate to God on the basis of works. They go to the Bible to find out what to do, rather than to believe what he's going to do for them. How many times have you been in a fix and you go to the Bible to find out what to do? Now you get one of those topical Bibles and you find a topic, a depression. Okay, what do I need to do to get rid of this depression? So you find whatever. I mean, faith teachers are notorious to give you steps, secrets, and keys and formulas. They'll keep you busy for the rest of your life to get what has been promised. I mean, children understand the difference between promise and a command. I shared this. If Johnny wants mom to get him a toy from Walmart and she says, yes, honey, I will, and he says, promise, he's not going to clean his room because it's not conditional. It's not transactional. She said yes, and that's it. He can just do whatever he wants to do in the house. He can watch TV, he can go play ball. There's nothing on him, and the fact that he believes her is what makes it happen. He believes. Just like Abraham, he believed and God credited to him as righteousness. Now, Paul says, when you're outside the covenant of promise, he says you're without hope. If you do this thing outside of promise, you know why you're without hope? Because you're trusting in you to make something happen, and that's hopeless. Abraham, it says, he hoped against hope, meaning all hope was against him. And yet his hope was not in himself. Well, maybe this thing will just work out. We'll wait and see. No. He had an earnest expectation that God, who was faithful, is going to fulfill the promise. So, many today have a performance relationship with God. They go to the Bible to find out what to do. They make the Bible a manual, a textbook, a self-help program of some sort. Now, you're going to find out that salvation is by grace. You already know that, but here's what you've either going to find out or have found out is once you're in, now you got to work for it. It's up to you. And blessings become conditional. I don't understand that. The most important thing in your life is salvation. Having your eyes awakened to your deliverance in Christ. And yet, you can't do anything to earn that. But once we get in, we start this performance that all the blessings end up being conditional. I remember going to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to see a particular speaker. Well, they had several. We got there late Friday night, and the guy that was speaking when we got there was not one that we wanted to hear, and he's from California. If I said his name, you'd know him. And we walked in and we thought, oh, we're in time to catch, we got there like a little late, but we were going to be able to catch most of the message. Well, he had 23 things that you needed to do to get healed, and he just wrote a book. Of course, his books are out there, and I'm sitting there going, wait, what? 23 things to do to get healed? And I thought, I sat there, I was going to give, I don't want to be rude, but after like 3 or 4, I'm like, I can't do this. And I got up and walked out, and I just hung out in the foyer. And somebody, part of our group, because we went up with a lot of people, came out and said, hey, what's going on? I guess they were going to the bathroom. I'm like, dude, I can't handle that. I said, healing is not something you got to work for. It's been provided by Christ called finished work. But anyway, so many people feel like that blessings are conditional. If your salvation was not conditional, what part of the salvation package is conditional? If it starts off grace, it goes by the whole thing is grace and it ends in grace. The whole thing is by grace. And so you get that in Ephesians chapter 2, 9 and 10. By grace through faith are you saved. Now watch this. You want to know what grace is? Read the rest of it and put it in context. Not by your works, lest any man can boast. So if it's not by works, then it's free. Then it's unmerited. You can't do anything because Jesus already did it for you, called finished work. Okay? In fact, if you really want to take this thing further, what's it say in Revelation? He was the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. The lamb slain before the foundation of the world, right? And then you were in Christ before the foundation of the world. So this thing was fixed before it got broken. You start at the finish line. It's a finished work, and everything is by grace through faith. Now, Galatians chapter 3, verse 13 and 14 says, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us, for it is written, curse is everyone who hangs on a tree. Now look at verse 4. So he redeems us. He takes the curse. Why? That the blessing of Abraham might come on us all. That the blessing of Abraham would be ours. Freely given. Remember the verse I left you with last week? That if Christ did not withhold his son, but with his son will he not freely give us all things? Romans 8:32. So this whole thing is by promise. That the blessing, some blessings you don't earn blessings. I know that we're brought up, oh yeah, you're saved by grace, but you got to earn all the blessings. They're all conditional. Why? Because they take the covenant of Moses and they read it into the New Testament and they bring works into a covenant called promise. I just showed you, Ephesians 2. It's a covenant of promise. It's not performance. It's Abraham given by promise. So in other words, going back to Galatians 3:18, God gave it to Abraham by promise. And Paul's setting the record straight. Now, I shared a story with you by Dudley Hall last week where he turned the C's, commands, once he got the revelation, he had to go back to the Mosaic covenant and turn all those commands into promises. And I didn't finish that part. I want to add to that because I was listening to a guy who obviously understands the Greek language. And this is what he says. You get ready for this. In the Greek language, there's the imperative mood and the indicative mood. And they can be seen exactly in the same form. What does that mean? That means that all the commands in scriptures can be translated legitimately as a statement of fact. Interesting, isn't it? And so here's an example. If you love me, you'll keep my commandments. So now what happens? We all try to love God with you can't. Oh, you can only love God with the love that's been shed abroad in your heart. You can only love God through the shared life with Christ. His love is the only sufficient love. Our love is conditional. Our love is eros. Our love is messed up. But when the love of God is shed abroad in our hearts, we love. So it's something, it's a statement of fact then. It's not something, now listen, let me put it this way. Here's an example. If you keep my commandments, in the Greek, the form is exactly the same as if you'd say this. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. Not based on you. It's a statement of fact, not conditional of, if you love me, then you'll do this. No, if you love me, you will do this. You know, we ought to know this without having me said that, because Paul or Jeremiah said, the prophet, that God was going to write everything, the law, everything on our hearts. And that no man would have to come to you and say, know the Lord, know the Lord. Well, you could just say this. No man will come to you and say, love the Lord, love the Lord. Because they will all love me. They will all know me. Okay? So this stuff is, it's done. It's a statement of fact. It's not, for instance, you will be my witnesses. So we think, oh, I got to go out there and I got to witness. I got to witness. No, you will be. You will be a witness. Christ in you will be a witness to those outside of you. So these are not commands. These are you can now look at them as a statement of fact because he's already did it. So whether you want to look at it through that lens or through making your C's into P's, I'm telling you, you cannot look at the Bible anymore and read it through the lens of Moses. You have to now read it through the lens of Jesus because Jesus is greater than Moses. The law comes through Moses, but grace and truth comes through Jesus. Those are diametrically opposed to each other. One's called faith and the other one's called works. All right? Now, let me move on from that. Religion cannot conceive a Bible without commands. It's always going to give it to you in commands rather than promises. Now, the fear of man is that we take license and pervert the gospel of grace and turn it into sin and license the sin and indulgence, not understanding that the grace has the power to transform you into holy living. Grace is unveiling who he already is, and that is in us, and it manifests effortlessly when faith is involved. We get a revelation of it believing just like Abraham. Now, when you get to 2 Peter, now watch this, 1:3, as his divine power has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness. Remember what I said. Everybody thinks they've got to earn their blessing. They've got to earn God's promises. But here Peter says it's his divine power that has given us all things. Not our ability to perform, our ability to do. It says by his divine power he has given us everything that pertains to life and godliness. And he'll go on to say that he has given us exceedingly great and precious promises. And by partaking of his divine nature, we receive those promises. And then he'll say at the end of verse 4, he says, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. How do you escape the corruption that's in the world through lust? These promises, by partaking of his divine nature. How many times have you tried to escape your lust, your addictions, by doing something? Look at 2 Peter 1:4. He clearly says that we escape corruption that's in the world through lust. How? By promises. Not by more commands, not by putting more burdens on people that they've got to do. Where did we ever come up with that commands delivers us? The more we obey, the less we'll sin. That doesn't work. And they say, well, that's what Moses told the people. Well, Paul will come back and say he did that to show us how utterly sinful we were in our in our messed up identity, in our unrenewed mind. You can't do that. That's going to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And he put the law there to show you how utterly sinful you become when you're eating from that tree. All right, we dealt with all that. So, by divine power, not by your fleshly efforts. All right, let me move on, because I want to leave you with a story that I think you'll find interesting. But we got to get we got to jump. Man, I'm not gonna. I'm telling you, I'm going to try to get as far as I can, but we'll have to probably continue this next week. There is a lot here. I remember a story, and this story is a true story, and it's a part 1 and part 2, but you're going to get both parts here in a minute. So this individual that I'm good friends with, John Sheesby, and he's a minister, and years ago, he gets a phone call, and from friends. Him and his wife are friends with this guy and his wife, and I guess the man had been caught cheating, and his wife calls John's wife and says, he's been cheating, I caught him. And so his wife says, you need to get down there and talk to him. So you got to set him straight. I can't believe he's cheated on her, blah, blah, blah. So he gets in the car and he drives, and he's like, oh man, this is going to be a horrible encounter. But he's going to go and do what he can do for the guy. And so he gets there, and the guy's very, upset, obviously. And so John says, let's just pray. So he's just praying for the guy, and he doesn't know what to say, and he's praying, and all of a sudden he starts prophesying to the guy. Now get this. This is what comes out of my friend's mouth to this guy who just cheated. That God is going to make him a worship leader with a Davidic spirit of worship, like David. And this is coming, and he's prophesying this, and it's like, this is not what an adulterer should get from God. But he's going with it, and then this next thing comes out, and I'm going to make you a millionaire. And it's like, wait, what? This guy just got done cheating, or just got caught cheating. He's just confessed it. And God is coming to him with promises, prophetic promises, that he's going to be a great worship leader. And on top of that, with his business, he will become a millionaire. You don't do that. You get that guy in a headlock, you start pulling his hair like Nehemiah did, and you make them repent. And then you've got to put them on this course of discipline and sit down, and you can't do this, and you got to go to counseling, and we got hoops, man. We got hoops for people like him to jump through. Well, the hoops that God gave him were called promises. He goes back to his wife, and she says, what'd you say to him? And he's like, oh man, this is not going to go well. Told him that he was going to be a worship leader with the spirit of David and Davidic worship, and he's going to be a millionaire. What? That's what God said. I got to say what God says. And this is what I prophesied over the man. Well, this was the story. And I believe this was probably in the late 80s, early 90s. But, so when John came back around to minister in our church, he had the rest of the story. This is part 2. Guess what happened? The dude ended up being a worship leader and a millionaire. And this is from the horse's mouth. I ain't making this stuff up. What am I saying here? God treats adulterers totally different than religious people do. God gives them promises. You know what we give them? Things they got to do to earn their way back. You know, and it's like, sit down. You don't deserve to do this, that, or the other. You got to do this and you got to do that. And God's like, no, this is my recovery program. This is how I restore sinning saints. I give them promises. Well, if that doesn't blow your mind, I don't know what will. So let's go. Let's jump into here. I got a couple minutes. I'm going to try to work this thing out with Jacob. And Genesis chapter 28. I'm going to have to. You need to read it on your own. Genesis chapter 28, 10 through 15, and you know the story about Jacob. So he's in this. You know, he's a heel catcher. He's a cheat. He's this. He's that. In spite of his character, he's flawed, but God has to give promises to him. God's going to have to work with him through promise like his grandfather, Abraham. Because it's Abraham, the covenant's to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Israel. So he's going to have to make covenant through promise. Because that's how it was with Abraham until the covenant change when it goes to Moses. He's going to deal with these patriarchs by promise. You got that? So when Jacob is in a bad place, in verse 15, listen to what he says to him. I am with you, Jacob, and I'm going to watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Look at that. Who's making the promise? God says, I'm never going to leave you. In fact, I am going to stick around and I'm going to follow you everywhere you go. That's what it says. Wherever you go. Where you go, I go. And I am going to fulfill. I am not going to leave you till you get everything in your life that I promised you. Now, what as Jacob returns, if you go to verse 20, he comes back and says, Lord, if you do this for me, I'll give you 1/10 of everything that I have. Does he need to do that? Does Jacob need to do that? God never said, hey, now I'm going to be with you wherever you go, and I'm going to fulfill every promise that I make if you tithe to me. If you give me 1/10 of everything that you get in life, you can activate this, and you can walk this thing out. In fact, it's the master key to these promises, that 1/10. Of everything that you have and everything you're going to have. Is that what you can read that till the cows come home? You're not going to get that. That's Jacob bartering with God, trying to secure, Lord, you know what? If you do that, let me just say, I really want that. I want everything in my life that you have ordained for me. So I'm going to make sure you do that. I'm going to give you 1/10 of everything that I get. He didn't have to do that. And you really don't see God even honoring that or saying, hey, yeah, oh man, what an awesome man that was, you know. It's just like he says it and then it didn't matter. It didn't matter whether he gave 1/10 or not. This is what God was going to do. Because why? Let's go back to Paul in Galatians. Because God gave it to Abraham by promise. Not by 1/10. Now, you've got these people who want to go to and say, well, Abraham tithed to the king of Salem, Melchizedek. One time you see that, and we're going to make a doctrine out of that for the New Covenant Church. That's the Abrahamic covenant. And so the tithe was in the Abrahamic covenant because, well, thank God, you guys, that he didn't give him 50% of everything that he had. Would you have done that? Would you be a 50%er? You better be thankful he did only 10. Because the way you treat that scripture, if he would have done 75, I think you'd walk away and say, well, I agree. That was the Abrahamic covenant. That's just what he did. Paul says, give what you purpose. It was what if Paul says in giving in 2 Corinthians 8, and he says, this is grace giving. Whatever you in the Spirit works out, basically. What you purpose in your heart. Don't give what you don't have. Whatever you purpose in your heart. Well, that's what Abraham did. He purposed in his heart. I don't want to get on that, but I'm just saying this is Jacob bartering with God. Boy, if you really do that, how many times you get a promise and you go, oh, I'm going to really work on myself now. I really want that promise. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. God's like, I never ever asked you to do that. Now you're going to be in the works of the flesh. And when you go to the law to try to perform to secure this promise, you're going to get yourself into trouble like Abraham did taking Hagar into the tent. Is this making sense? So whatever he says to Jacob, I'm going to do it all. I did it for your grandfather. I did it for your father. I'm going to do it for you. This is a covenant of promise. Well, the beauty of it is, guys, honestly, is that this is what Paul settles this thing in Galatians. He settles it and says, look, this thing is a covenant of promise. And God, again, Galatians 3:18, God gave it to Abraham by promise. And there's nothing else that we can do. How often do we limit God? Because we don't believe in promises. So what do you mean? I got 1 minute. I mean this. Because you're not looking at it through the lens of promise, there's only one other way to look at it. What you got to engineer and orchestrate to get something done and hope God blesses it. Or find something in the Bible to do and give it your all and hope that God comes through on his end. And it's so limiting because if you can't see it, then if you have a limited imagination, you have a limited understanding, you can only go so far. Now Paul will say he's able to do above and beyond what we can ask or think. That's only when we listen to promise. Now I really hate that I got to cut you off here. I am definitely going to continue this next week because everything comes by promise. If you get anything after these last 3 or 4 messages, you got to understand you cannot go after this except by any other way or means except by promise. I'll see you next week on the NRZ, the No Religion Zone.
Thank you for tuning in to the NRZ. To contact us, go to our website at greglilly.com. And if God lays on your heart to give, according to Galatians 6:6, you can access the different ways you can give. That's greglilly.com.